Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. This time we're taking a look at a behind-the-scenes Star Wars documentary that is actually a new release. You don't see new releases for Star Wars very much these days, though they are finally starting to roll out some of that Disney Plus content that, of course, we have covered and will be covering. This is actually something that is so new that it fits the pattern of some stuff that I covered in a Saga on Home Video, but of course couldn't have been covered because of when that came out. But there's an entire chapter in Volume 3 of my Saga on Home Video 2nd edition that is all about behind-the-scenes stuff, called Behind the Curtain. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff on Star Wars, much of which focuses on the making of the original film, and then kind of, some of them build beyond that, but then most of the stuff for behind the scenes for like the prequels, you'll see instead on the discs themselves rather than separate releases. But there's a ton of behind the scenes Star Wars content out there in documentary form. Frankly, the story behind the making of the original Star Wars film, now known as A New Hope, frankly, we've seen it, 500-600 times already in book form, in documentary form, over and over and over again. So it takes a lot for something to be a behind-the-scenes special for Star Wars, or a documentary about the making of Star Wars, however you want to put that, that actually has a sort of twist to it, or an angle to it, that really catches my interest these days. Because most of the time it's just like, yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. Wow, I've seen that footage dozens of times already. Oh, look, it's Harrison and Mark and Carrie walking towards the camera on the Death Star set, and he's got a cigarette in his hand that Disney would eventually edit out. Yay. It's the same stuff over and over and over. The same stories over. And even like ILM documentary had a lot of heavy overlap when we looked at it. But at least that, again, took a different angle, because it was a documentary about ILM, so it wasn't as focused on Star Wars, though there was quite a bit of it, and it took sort of their perspective on it. This is another of these that has a different angle on it, primarily, I think, because of one primary person who is interviewed as one of the main subjects of this documentary. It's not subject in terms of like who it's about, although it is to a degree, but more the subject in terms of who is providing firsthand information in interview form. That is a new documentary released last year and now released on home media this year in 2024 called Icons Unleashed Star Wars. Okay, so we have the Blu-ray symbol up here with a yellow bar, which is kind of unusual, just fits their theme though. A 6-part documentary series. Bonus features include over 6 hours of full unseen interviews with Marsha Lucas, Anthony Daniels, and Billy D. Williams. Icons Unearthed, Star Wars. Spine there, Icons Unearthed, Star Wars. Then you have your 2-disc set. You have the Nacelle Company logo. You have the Mill Creek Entertainment logo. And then you have Blu-ray and a very teeny tiny product number. Effectively the same thing on the other side. Obviously no top or bottom because it's just a slipcover. And then the back here says, featuring behind-the-scenes interviews with the cast and crew of the Star Wars films. There are quite a few people interviewed. I will run down some of them, but I made a gigantic list of everybody who's in here who is interviewed, and most did actually have a hand in the making of the films in some way. But I guess you could say it's sort of the cast and crew from a certain point of view. Lucas himself isn't interviewed at all. Neither is, say, Irvin Kershner or anybody like that, right? So they're not using like archival footage in cases where they need to, or new interviews. And when it comes to, like, for example, the cast, there's no interview with, like, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, no interview with, Ewan McGregor, or Hayden Christensen, or Natalie Portman, but it does have some big-name interviewees in here, recognizable, known names and faces from the films, just not those. Just not those people that you would think of immediately when you think the cast of Star Wars is being interviewed. Yeah, cast members. One of whom was pretty big. Actually, 2 of whom are pretty big, though one is barely in it at all, but billed as if they were one of the main ones. But it does have an eclectic mix of people from different stages in the process, from different angles on the process, to provide some new perspectives that we haven't seen, if not at all before, then at least not as much before as some of the primaries. And this is an unauthorized documentary, essentially. It is about Star Wars not being put out by, Disney, for instance, or in the past, Fox Video or whoever. So it's not this internal sanitized kind of behind the scenes thing in this case. So you got images down here of Billy D. Williams, Marsha Lucas, and Anthony Daniels. You have your stats about the disc itself. You have your copyright and your various logos down here. Up here, it says, "A long time ago." From the earliest screenplay draft to the excitement when the lights go down in the theater, Icons Unearthed digs up the real story of how the most iconic media franchises in history were made. Filmed everywhere from Tunisia to England, Canada to Italy, all 50 states, this series features a treasure trove of incredible information, including Marsha Lucas's first ever on-camera interview. Conversations with cast, crew, and experts gives us the deepest of dives into how the franchises we thought we knew inside and out were actually put together. Directed by Brian Volk-Weiss. And then bonus features include over 6 hours with never-before-seen uncut interviews with Marsha Lucas, 192 minutes, Anthony Daniels, 173 minutes, and Billy D. Williams, 37 minutes. Billy D. Williams is barely in this, and you can, I guess, see why, because the actual uncut interview is relatively short compared to those other ones. Marsha Lucas and Anthony Daniels are in it throughout. And I think it's the Marsha Lucas angle that gives it sort of a different flavor than what we are used to seeing. Taking this off here, we have essentially the same thing here. The duplication of the Blu-ray symbol here, which is a little bit odd, but again, kind of same thing. Slightly rearranged and shrunk, but essentially the same. And here as well. The discs are pretty basic in their look. Icons Unearthed Star Wars, Nacelle, Mill Creek Entertainment. Then over here you got TV-14, Region A. I do not know if it's actually region locked. Sometimes it'll say A when it's not. I have not tried this in a non-A player. Then we have the Blu-ray symbol. Legalese going around the edges with a product number at the bottom. And then the main bulk of information here says Disc 1 and has the episode titles, which we will touch on in just a moment. And then this is Disc 2, which simply says bonus features and lists the complete interviews with Marsha Lucas, Anthony Daniels, and Billy D. Williams. I will note here that I did not watch all the way through these uncut interviews. That's a lot of stuff. The quality is not as good as the stuff that's actually used for the regular documentary because it's not as cleaned up, footage or whatever. But in jumping around, there were some interesting topics that you can tell are covered in those that were not covered in the documentary itself. Like I jumped around and saw a thing where, Marsha Lucas kind of talking about a relationship with Mark Hamill and stuff, for example, and his wife. So interesting stuff if you really want to deep dive into those three perspectives. But after rushing to try to get through the entire documentary series in time to record today, I did not dive too much into those. But they are there uncut for what it's worth. I'm usually not someone for uncut interviews. I guess speaking as someone who has been a podcaster before, I want the fluff cut and the stuff that is relevant or the stuff that is interesting. And if it's just kind of banter or repeated information, I don't feel like I always need it. Not that I am one to complain to anyone about not repeating myself, over and over again, repetitively, redundantly, multiple times. So the way it is broken down is it's actually a little bit odd. You would think with 6 episodes it'd be 1 per film, but it's really not. What they do is they sort of stretch out the A New Hope coverage and condense the coverage of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. But it is all covered. It's covering all of the Lucas-era live-action films, which is kind of cool that they actually do that rather than just focusing on the original trilogy. So we've got A New Hope Part 1, and it basically runs up through filming and whatnot. Then you have A New Hope Part 2, which is primarily the post-production period. Lots of stuff covered in both. And that is where Marsha Lucas plays like the biggest role, I guess you could say, in talking about that production process. But then she is back again, of course, for the next 2, where we look at The Empire Strikes Back in Episode 3, and then Return of the Jedi in Episode 4, before jumping over to The Phantom Menace in the penultimate episode, Episode 5, followed by, finally, Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith together in Episode 6 here. If there is a through line to this documentary series, it is the adversity they faced and ways of addressing it. And in some respects, there's a through line of personality clashes, I guess you could say. Like, I don't know that in watching any of the behind-the-scenes stuff, like from Star Wars: The Jedi, The Making of a Saga, it's been a while since I've watched it. I don't know that you would hear Anthony Daniels trash-talking Richard Marquand as this inexperienced guy who needed people looking over his shoulder, which is why Lucas was there on the set so much, and the clashes that happened with that, for example. I don't know that you would see that in these official sanitized documentaries. But it very much kind of got into that, got into why Gary Kurtz was not involved later on. There's a through line of Lucas's upbringing and relationship with his father, and the impact that things like his father's focus on how, entertainment wasn't a real profession per se, this is my words, but, owning your own business was. That it wasn't about, Lucas being successful once he made a successful film. It was once he had his own business that was successful in making the films. That kind of distinction there, and how that was sort of a driving factor. How when he and Marcia Lucas divorced, he was not willing to give up any part of his company. And that it was more like, here's a financial settlement, and then here's like a promissory note, but I'm going to pay it off right now rather than having it hang over my head for later. Stuff like that. But there's also the through line, because Marcia Lucas is the main, I guess you'd say, main person interviewed here, one of the main people interviewed here. John Dykstra is in there, Phil Tippett is in there, lots and lots of people. I'll run down some more information here in a moment, but because I took a ton of notes. But basically, the through line of how, in the case of A New Hope, a lot of what sort of saved the film in the edit in the latter days was Marcia Lucas, right? It was her and her sort of editing magic, so to speak, including her apparently being the one who, when ILM needed to visualize what was happening with special effects shots to be able to make the shots for the Battle of Yavin, it was actually, we know that they were using footage from old World War II movies. I think it's World War II movies, right? It's old movies, black and white movies of dogfights cut together to show what the sequence should look like. Well, apparently it was Marcia Lucas that cut that together to give them that basis to build upon. And there's tales told of, in the case of Return of the Jedi, taking a little bit more of a harder approach initially, but going instead with some of the softer performances from different takes from people like Mark Hamill, particularly in like the scene where Obi-Wan reveals a lot of heavy truths, the certain point of view conversation. And that really, in a lot of ways, the emotional scenes of Return of the Jedi were handed over to Marcia Lucas, even as the marriage was falling apart, so she could bring out that emotion in a way that Lucas couldn't. And the criticism that with the prequels, part of why the prequels didn't succeed as much, in many fans' eyes, as the original trilogy, was the absence of someone like a Marcia Lucas, who was focused on that emotional drawing out of characters and scenes and that sort of thing. That is a through line, along with their divorce, the context of it, the fact that he apparently thought that she cheated, she claims that she didn't, he said, she said, and how, after the divorce, it was as if, he didn't want her to exist anymore and had essentially cut off all contact, and that at this point, she is regretful that maybe she may never even get a chance to speak with him and say goodbye ever again before one of them passes away at this point. So just kind of that sort of personal through line here that you can only have when Marcia Lucas goes on the record and actually takes part in a documentary. But of course, there's not a ton of balance from the other side, because there isn't another side really heavily being presented here, because Lucas, for instance, is not a part of this. Anthony Daniels, lots of, his thoughts, complaints, his thoughts on the usage or lack thereof of C-3PO in the prequels, for example. Billy D. Williams is in there super briefly, to the point where he might as well not be there at all, basically. He's almost not in there at all in the entire thing. There's very little discussion of Lando, for example, at all, but he is in there. So let's take a look at some of these notes that I have here. Some notes, when I actually flip to the correct page here. So, among the people interviewed, Marsha Lucas, Anthony Daniels, John Dykstra, Billy D. Williams, Ian McDiarmid, which is actually a pretty cool interview there, Caroline Blackiston, Mon Mothma, Julian Glover, Veers. Then we've got, let's see, Howard Kazanjian, if I'm saying that right, Kazanjian. I always have trouble pronouncing his last name, even though I've heard it a million times. David West Reynolds, who of course was a fan, who became an archivist, who wound up assisting on finding the original Tatooine locations when they were going to go shoot the prequels. He refers to himself at one point about how Lucasfilm had a line or a rule about don't hire fans. So I feel a little bit of a personal connection there because I, of course, am a fan, and they were not allowing just regular fans to do anything with Star Wars writing either until there was a slight opening with Star Wars Tales, and I got my chance to write, equals and opposites for Star Wars Tales, that came out 20 years ago this year. I'll do a video on that at some point. But yeah, David West Reynolds is in there, Dale Pollock, Richard Edlund, Roger Christian, Ken Ralston, Paul Hirsch, Phil Tippett, Rick Baker, Dwayne Dunham, I think it's Dunham, Tim Rose, Dan Madsen, Jonathan Hales, talking about the rewriting or the script writing based on the story for episodes 2 and 3, Dave Elsey, Nikki Gooley, Victoria Bennett of Den of Geek, Ray Morton, is that Morton? My handwriting sucks. Film historian, Gus Lopez, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Most of these other people are like commentators on it, or there's some sociologists, and so on. Lots and lots of people interviewed for this thing, just not necessarily, Lucas or McCallum or and so on. Lots of stuff in here, though. Interesting things like apparently it was Marsha Lucas's idea to kill off Obi-Wan. Instead of it being that Obi-Wan was in the command center saying use the Force, Luke, that it would be like the spiritual thing instead. They do talk about the creation of the novel Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster and why it was created and how that's, for a while there was looking more and more like that's the only kind of sequel they could ever make if they were to make it on film. How the idea supposedly of having Vader be Luke's father came up during a dinner where somebody was suggesting a cool twist because they needed a hook to get from episode 2 to episode 3. How it was apparently Marsha Lucas that got Carrie to stop freaking using drugs during filming because she pointed out that Carrie looked like crap on camera to get her to finish filming Empire Strikes Back. Gosh, so much stuff here. Apparently, the reason why Warwick Davis was featured so heavily as Wicket having to do with Kenny Baker being Paplu and supposed to be that character, except when they tried to get him so that he could come and actually do the filming for it, he was drunk. So they brought in Warwick Davis's Wicket and just kind of ran with it from there. The interesting line that comes back at the end of Lucas talking about how, again, kind of going back to his dad's focus on, business being what matters in terms of success, how Lucas would never sell his company. And of course, he did eventually. Gosh, so much, like literally like notes and notes and notes and notes of stuff. Divorce term negotiation is in there. They do mention the Ewok droids and Ewok telemovie stuff on television. Different advancements that were made with things like Young Indiana Jones Chronicles that helps set up things later. The EU is brought up. The need for sort of keeping the marketing out there to keep things alive. The lack of Marsha Lucas supposedly being something that has been somewhat given as a reason for the Jabba insert in A New Hope Special Edition that repeats the Greedo information, basically, and the Greedo shooting first thing, supposedly being because of lack of Marsha, because she would have been someone who would have cut that out in the process. The fact that Benicio del Toro was actually meant to be in Star Wars at one point, and would have been playing Darth Maul, except there really wasn't much of a speaking part. And the fact that I believe, was it Jar Jar? But one of the characters was to initially possibly have been played with interest by Michael Jackson? Something like that. The heavier Yoda, how the height of Liam Neeson wound up playing a role in the set direction and set setup for Phantom Menace. How David West Reynolds was the one who set up the trailer for Phantom Menace, the first trailer. And the question of whether we show what's in the film, which he really wasn't as hot on, or do we build the ideal trailer to tug on the heartstrings? And we know which one, of course, they went with. The possibility at one point of casting Leonardo DiCaprio is in there. The digitized clones. that there's a cut scene where Padme was to be putting panels onto C-3PO, which it actually shows a bit of. It actually shows some of the other cut scenes we know of, for instance, from A New Hope, like the stuff at Tashi Station. There is some mocking of the "I don't like sand" line and the "no" at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Gosh, there's so much stuff. Jonathan Hales not liking Ewan McGregor's performance, really, in Attack of the Clones, feeling like he phoned it in. Interesting. The story that Tom Stoppard came in and helped with some script tweaking, but never got credited for it. Why Revenge of the Sith went from a PG rating to a PG-13 rating, that it all came down to the fact that they were trying to come up with a makeup for the burned Anakin, and we're like, remember, it's PG. Use a PG burn. He's like, what the hell's a PG burn? Okay, well, we'll just do it, and if it needs PG-13, then it needs to be the only Star Wars PG-13 at the time. The help at the end of Return of the Jedi from Steven Spielberg. Just so much stuff over time here. The fact that Marcia Lucas is only on one page in George Lucas, The Creative Impulse, which is kind of telling about, the kind of the cutting out and whatnot. The strained relationship between Howard Kazanjian and Lucas, and of course, eventually the fact that Marcia Lucas and George Lucas had one adopted child together. Then they divorced. She winds up getting remarried and then divorced again with another child. I think it's just one other child. And then, of course, Lucas, as a single father, adopting 2 more children, all 3 of those children would be playing a role, within Star Wars in some form. But Katie Lucas being a huge influence within the Clone Wars, though they don't really mention that aspect of it. And then, of course, Lucas's new marriage, which also has born a child through a surrogate, though I don't think the surrogate child is mentioned in this one. I can't recall. So lots and lots of stuff. Lots and lots of stuff. But for a story that we've heard a million times before, this is sort of the, not salacious, but leaning that direction, because it's from a different perspective. Story behind the 6 Lucas-driven live-action Star Wars films. No mention of the Clone Wars at all. They just kind of skipped that period of time completely. But kind of an interesting look into this. Something where, for someone who has heard this a million times before, I feel like the first couple of episodes I was like, yeah, I've heard this before. Yep, I know that. But even the latter ones, as it got more into the personal connections and relationships and whatnot, was a little bit eye-opening for me. And I think for anyone who has not watched a bunch of Star Wars behind-the-scenes stuff before, it'll be a pretty cool watch, and it gives itself enough room to breathe with 6 45-minute episodes that you actually, in that 4.5 hours, have a chance to get more depth than if you're trying to run through a quick, 2 to 3 hour, which is about the longest we've seen otherwise, behind-the-scenes individual special, like, say, Empire of Dreams, even in its longer version. So, yeah. I would say this is something I was glad that I watched. I'm not sure that I will ever watch those uncut interviews because I don't know that I could get through them. But good stuff, and definitely something I would recommend if you're into Star Wars documentaries. I'm trying to be very careful here with the sleeve as I put this back in because of something I will note here. My goodness, there we go. So, you'll notice here, side note, this copy, the corners are pretty decent. Well, this is actually the 3rd slipcover I've had for this. The first one came through Amazon, unscathed pretty much, nice looking, little bit on a corner, no big deal. And then my son got to it. This is why I cover my stuff in here with the curtains and whatnot. This was sitting on a desk in another room, and he just ripped it because he just likes ripping up anything paper he can get his hands on. So I was like, you know what, this is my fault. I'm going to just get another copy. I'm not going to say that it was damaged in transit and be dishonest. I'm just going to get another copy. So I get another copy through Amazon, and it comes with all kinds of beat up corners. You can barely see it there, but it's like a crease that runs down. Beat up other corners, kind of frustrating. But I'm like, you know what? I guess I'm just sticking with this. I'm not ordering the freaking thing all over again. But then I got lucky. Because there's a member of the Star Wars home video community, Andy Romano, who doesn't keep slipcovers for most of the stuff that he collects. Unless it's a special slipcover of some kind. And he was kind enough to send this slipcover my way recently to help me sort of replace the beat up one from Amazon and the torn up one from my son with one that actually will look nice on the shelf, which meant it was time to finally watch the thing so that I could speak intelligently about it now that it is presentable enough to show on the show here. So my thanks to Andy. I appreciate that. That definitely kept some frustration from boiling over after that second one arrived, to have that help kind of right there when it was needed. I appreciate it. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers.